Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Our guest today is attorney Dwayne Gaines. He's the owner of the law offices of Richard & Gaines. Welcome.
I appreciate your having me.
Dwayne, according to recent studies, the Washington region has some of the worst traffic and gridlock in the nation. And of course, where there's traffic and gridlock, there are accidents. So that's why we have you here as a guest today to tell us things like what's the first thing you should do if you're in a car accident?
Well, I think the most important item initially is to determine whether anyone is injured in the accident. That is by far the most important item. After determining whether anyone is injured, secondly, reporting the matter to the police. Now, one of the items that I'd like to point out in terms of police involvement in accidents, typically a police report will not be taken by the police unless someone is injured and they're subsequently transported to the hospital. If there are no complaints of injury which require transport to the hospital, typically the officers will require the parties to exchange information, name, address, phone number, insurance information, the name of the insurance carrier, and the policy number.
What if one party, one person in the accident is willing to cooperate, but the other person is not? What should you do?
In that particular instance, you really don't have a choice other than to contact the police and request that the police come to the scene. Even though you may have a scenario in which no one is injured, the police, again, once they're at the scene, they would then require the parties to exchange information.
What is personal injury protection? What is that under Maryland law?
Personal injury protection, it refers to a coverage that is available to individuals that are involved in accidents, and it's a coverage that's available under the individual's policy. So it is not a required coverage in the state of Maryland. It is an optional coverage. And what the personal injury protection coverage does, it provides reimbursement for medical expenses and lost wages up to $2,500, which is the basic limit. There are some companies that offer higher limits, but that coverage is available to an individual regardless of fault for the accident. So it doesn't matter if the individual was negligent. If you're involved in an accident, the triggering of that coverage is simply the happening of the accident.
What is the formula for damages? How do you determine what the damages are and what you receive as far as those damages are concerned?
What I typically explain to clients, what an insurance company will look at for the purpose of resolving a case, typically they'll look at what type of injury the individual had sustained, how long you were in treatment, the amount of your medical expenses, how much time was missed from work, how much money was lost as a result. I think by far the most important item that the insurance company will look at is what the doctor indicates in his final report. Does he indicate that the individual recovered from the injury and what we call is asymptomatic, or is the individual, does it appear, will have problems in the future, or what we call residuals? And those are the factors essentially that an insurance company will look at.
How do you determine whether you should handle the case one-on-one with the insurance company or whether it's time to seek the help of an attorney?
Well, first of all, I think the biggest mistake that many people will make in terms of accidents is the decision to attempt to handle a case on their own. The reason that I make that comment, before I became an attorney, I worked as a claim representative for an insurance company for 8 years before I became an attorney, so I had the benefit of working on the other side. Frankly, I think that insurance companies are pleased to get the news that someone is going to attempt to handle a case on their own. The reason is that most laypersons are not going to have an understanding as to the value of a case. The advantage of having an attorney involved is if that attorney concentrates in the area of personal injury, they have a good indication as to what cases settle for, based upon what would happen, let's say, if we filed a lawsuit in a particular jurisdiction, how much would a judge or a jury award in that particular jurisdiction.
Do you see a lot of, in this area, I know as a news person, that we hear a lot of stories about drunk driving cases. Do you see a lot of those in your practice? And if so, how is that handled?
I think that it is a big problem. In fact, and it's interesting that you mention it, that the legislature has recently passed a law involving the interlock ignition for persons that are driving a vehicle while intoxicated. And the law now will require that an individual have the interlock device, which they have to blow into a device which will determine whether that person is capable of driving based upon the blood alcohol content reading, which is a significant item. I think that it's a good idea, I think that it was a very good idea that the legislature moved forward with this type of law. In terms of the question of whether a person, what happens under the circumstances in which an individual is driving while intoxicated, it does not impact what an insurance company is willing to offer in order to resolve a case, frankly. The threshold issue in terms of a case is simply determining whether that party was negligent, and as a result of the individual's negligence, they were involved in the accident.
So that's part of what we hear so much about, pain and suffering. So the fact that the person may have been driving while intoxicated and you suffered an injury as a result of that, that's not, you don't get anything for the emotional damage or whatever that may have occurred as a result of you getting injured from that.
Well, essentially the same factors come into play in terms of evaluating the case. However, if you have a scenario in which someone is involved in an accident and they're intoxicated at the time, and it's clear that they were in fact responsible for the accident, I think under those circumstances, an insurance company is going to, I think they're going to look at it differently in terms of making an offer to settle a case versus allowing that case to enter into the litigation process.
We've all got bills to pay, and a lot of people worry if they do suffer from some sort of injury, how are my bills going to get paid? What am I going to do? If I do hire an attorney, how long is this thing going to last? Will I be able to feed my family? Will I be able to go back to work?
That is by far one of the most difficult aspects of personal injury cases, because it's very disruptive to an individual's life. You know, of course, they're incurring expenses that they normally would not incur as a result of being involved in an accident. What I typically explain to clients is the amount of time that a case takes before it is resolved, it really depends upon how long an individual is in treatment, because the entire settlement process does not start until the individual is done with their treatment. So it is not until the individual has formally been discharged by the doctor. We obtain all of the medical bills, medical reports. You could have medical bills and reports from the emergency room, other medical providers or specialties. So you have to get all of those, all of that information, and then we put together a settlement package which is submitted to the insurance company. But you could have a scenario in which someone's in treatment for 6 months. So if you're in treatment for 6 months, the process in terms of preparing the case for settlement does not start until that 6-month treatment period has ended.
What other cases would fall under the umbrella of negligence?
One of the other areas in negligence is something that we refer to as premises liability cases, or cases in which someone is injured on the property of a third party. It still involves the concept of negligence and the requirement that you must show that the owner of the property was negligent or did something wrong, and as a result the individual was injured. But it also has a requirement that we must also show that the owner of the property knew or had reason to know that there was a dangerous condition existing on the property and did nothing about it, and ultimately the client came along and was injured as a result.
That sounds like that would be pretty difficult to prove.
It is. Unfortunately, the law in Maryland it tends to be somewhat weighted in favor of the property owner versus the injured party when it comes to a premises liability case.
Some of us, or many of us, live in what we call the sandwich generation, where we're taking care of our children and we're taking care of aging parents. So a lot of us have the responsibility of possibly looking into nursing homes for our loved ones. Do you all deal with that as part of your negligence? If a nursing home, for example, is negligent in taking care of your loved one?
Yes, we do. In fact, nursing home negligence cases, we see a lot more of it now because for the very reason that you've indicated. But you have scenarios in which there may be an instance in which the nursing home failed to provide adequate care or services, and an individual is injured as a result. For example, nursing home falls, which is very common, a scenario in which someone is admitted to a nursing home, they're undergoing treatment, and for some reason that individual is injured as a result of falling, whether it's failure to install bed alarms, failing to place mats on either side of the bed, things of that nature. In addition, another area where you see many cases are what we call pressure sores as a result of persons not being turned at the appropriate times or as frequently as necessary, and it results in claims as a result of that having occurred.
How do you determine that something's going on? How do you determine that your loved one may have fallen or may have gotten injured as a result of a nursing home? How do you determine that?
Well, one of the items, of course, we have to rely initially upon what the client is providing us in the way of information, but oftentimes there are reports that are generated by the nursing home. In addition, anytime that there's an injury on the premises, you can request an investigation by the state of Maryland. They would come in and do a formal investigation of the nursing home with regard to that particular incident.
When it comes to negligent cases like that, what is the nursing home response? What do they owe you as a client?
Well, I think, and this is a legal concept, but they're required to provide a certain level of care in terms of persons that are at the nursing home, in terms of monitoring individuals that are there, and that becomes important in terms of the fall cases that I mentioned earlier. If a person is not being properly monitored, then it increases the likelihood of a person falling. For example, if a person goes into a nursing home, there are issues maybe involving dementia, other conditions that are involved. So oftentimes you'll have a situation in which someone attempts to get out of their bed. And while in the process of trying to get out of the bed, they fall and sustain serious injuries.
Do you think we're seeing so many cases, not just because there are more elderly people now than ever before, but are we seeing more cases because maybe the quality of care has decreased over the years?
Well, I think that it's a combination of both. I mean, there's been a huge increase in terms of the volume of cases that are being handled by nursing homes, and sometimes the quality of care is in keeping pace with the volume of patients that are coming through the door.
Let's talk about some other areas of negligence. For example, if you are stopped by police for some reason and you feel like you were mistreated, would that be considered under the umbrella of negligence?
Well, it has facets in terms of negligence. For example, you have cases involving police misconduct or instances in which an individual may be assaulted by a police officer. So you have various causes of action that can be raised under those circumstances, which you have cases involving false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, things of that nature. But it also gets into the concept of negligence because the concept of negligence can also arise in terms of the employer and negligent supervision, things of that nature. So there are many aspects of negligence, as you can see, through the various areas that we've already talked about.
So there can be negligence on the job as well.
That is correct. Now, negligence on the job, and it's interesting that you point that out as well. If someone is injured on the job and it's basically out of and during the course of their employment, then we're getting into another area, which is workers' compensation, which provides compensation for injured individuals that are working at the time that they sustain an injury.
So is that a separate area, or
yes,
is that
is.
okay? But where would negligence on the job fall under the umbrella of your area of law?
The only time that it would really happen is if you're injured on the job and it is due to the negligence of a third party that is other than your employer. For example, let's say that you're on the job, you're working, and there's a private contractor that comes in and they're responsible for cleaning and maintaining the building. And while they're performing services there, let's say that we have a scenario in which they fail to post warning signs or caution signs and they're cleaning the floor and someone falls as a result. Under those circumstances, you would then have a potential negligence claim involving that private contractor that's providing cleaning services for the owner of the building.
We talked a little bit about this earlier, but summer is coming, and we know a lot of times kids go to pool parties with friends. What happens if a child goes to a pool party and drowns on a friend's property? What responsibility does the parent have in that, the homeowner parent?
You're still dealing with the concept of negligence, and you have to show that the owner of the property was negligent or did something wrong, and as a result, the person drowned on the premises. If the owner of the property is able to show that they acted reasonably under the circumstances, they were monitoring the activities of the kids while they were swimming, there was an adult present at all times, then it's more difficult to show that they did something wrong under the circumstances.
God forbid if a child died in a situation like that. Is that considered wrongful death?
A wrongful death case can arise out of negligence in that context, in the context of a automobile accident. Under those circumstances, the claim or the action is being brought by either the parents or a relative of the deceased party or the estate.
And so so wrongful death has a lot of different, there can be a lot of different scenarios, for example, that could label a particular case wrongful death. How successful have people been in that area? If you've got a loved one who passed and you suspect it's at the hands of someone who was negligent, how successful are those cases in the state of Maryland?
Well, it all depends upon what type of case that we're dealing with. Of course, we have wrongful death cases in the context of an automobile accident. If you're able to establish that the driver of the other vehicle was negligent or did something wrong, or you have cases in which you may have what we had talked about earlier, someone that's driving under the influence of alcohol that causes an accident and someone subsequently dies, then the claim that the individual is making is a wrongful death claim that's being made by the relatives or, again, the estate of the individual.
You know what can appear to be just as tragic as someone driving under the influence is people who are driving are driving drowsy. We saw the incident with the comedian who was coming from a comedy show or whatever, and he was struck by a driver driving a Walmart vehicle who was drowsy during while driving.
And that happens in many instances. Many times when we're dealing with an accident which involves a rear-end collision, you may have a scenario in which someone falls asleep behind the wheel or is driving while intoxicated and strikes another vehicle in the rear, and it can result in very serious injury.
There's another thing that we didn't see 20 years ago as drivers, people texting while driving, distracted drivers. You're texting, you're on a phone call, you're putting on makeup. I have seen people reading the newspaper while they're driving. Have you seen more of a trend of that over the last 24 years that you've been practicing?
Absolutely. That is very true. And, you know, it's not only, you know, texting, but persons that are using their telephone. You may see people, you know, people that are attempting to read the newspaper or magazine while they're driving. It's absolutely unbelievable that you see some of these things. But I think that Maryland is definitely, you know, taking a stand in terms of, you know, the laws with regard to use of a text messaging device or using the phone at the time that they're involved in an accident, because clearly it is the cause for many accidents that occur today.
Is that the biggest trend you've been seeing over the last couple of years? Is that, or are there other areas that you see that have grown over the years?
I think that area is definitely one of the most significant areas, because we're now in a society where people heavily rely on the use of cellular devices, whether they're using it for text messaging, whether they're using it to check on the news at a particular point in time. So you see it a lot more often now. That is correct.
What would you say, earlier we talked about the benefits of getting an attorney opposed to handling the case with your insurance company, and I'm sure the insurance companies would say, well, that's not true. What should you do if you've been in a situation and you're feeling like, okay, I don't know what to do about this, they're offering me something immediate, where if I hire an attorney, it's going to take some time? How would you convince that person that the smartest way to go is to use an attorney who knows the ins and outs of the system much better than I would as a layperson?
Well, one of the first things that I would stress to a client is, if you are thinking about resolving a case, you have to be 100% certain that you're fine physically, that you're no longer having any problems. The reason that becomes important is, once you enter into a settlement with the insurance company, first of all, they will ask you to sign off on a release form. And that's basically a document which indicates that you're agreeing to settle a case for a certain amount, and they ask you to sign off on the document. Now, what is also important is, once you sign that document, you're done. You can't go back to the insurance company again.
What if you realize a couple of weeks, a couple of months down the road that you have more injuries? Something that didn't hurt initially now is bothering you. You can't go back?
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. And that is the main reason why, when I initially meet with clients before they go to a doctor, I always stress the importance of advising the doctor about any and everything that presents a problem, regardless of how minor you may think it is. Something that is minor today, 2-3 weeks down the road, it may not be. So that is extremely important. But back to the initial item that you're asking about, in terms of a decision to settle a case, I always stress the importance of making sure that you've received the appropriate medical care and that you're 100%, that you're back to where you were in terms of level of function before the accident occurred.
And let's go back to the beginning once more. We were talking about what you should do if you were in an accident situation. How important are witnesses, if it's a his word against your word thing, or that's not really an issue?
It becomes relevant. It certainly becomes relevant if you have an opportunity to obtain information concerning a witness. Of course, you want to make sure that you obtain that information, because sometimes if you're dealing with an accident scenario in which there is some question as to how the accident occurred, you do not have the benefit of statements from passengers in your vehicle because they're considered biased witnesses. And there's a presumption that if someone's a passenger in your vehicle, they're going to give an account of the accident which is favorable to you. So for that reason, if there's an independent witness, someone that stops at the scene and asks whether you're okay, I would inquire as to whether the person actually saw the accident, and if so, I would get that person's name, address, and phone number in the event that there's a problem down the road.
And of course, we live in this video age where you can use your cell phone to document. Is that a smart idea as well?
Many people are doing that now in terms of either taking photographs at the scene, taping the conversation with the other driver in order to deal with the issue of liability or responsibility for the accident. And what many people fail to realize, even if a police officer comes to the scene, the only item that the police officer can actually attest to is what they observed at the time that they arrived at the accident scene. For example, the positioning of the vehicles at the time that they arrived at the scene, but a police officer is not in a position to assess liability or responsibility for an accident. Again, it would be based upon the statements of the parties involved, witnesses. Of course, if a police officer is able to provide testimony as to what he or she observed at the scene, that may be helpful in terms of a liability decision by the insurance company, but unfortunately it does not carry the day.
This has been a very insightful discussion. I had no idea that there were so many things that fall under the umbrella of negligence.
It is definitely, it's an area that it's still continuing to grow. We see other cases, and again, in this particular area, in view of the volume of persons that come to the area and so forth, it is definitely a major practice area here in the state of Maryland.
Thank you so much for joining us. For the sake of disclosure, we've been talking to attorney Dwayne Gaines, owner of the law offices of Richard and Gaines, who just happens to be my older brother. Thanks again. You've been watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. Have a great day.